All right. Hello, good morning, and welcome to the session Private Sector Innovation for the SDGs. This session is specifically focused on how private sector companies, technology companies can partner with the international development sector, humanitarian organizations, and put data or analytics and other tools to use to drive impact on the SDGs. So I have a distinguished panel with me today. I'm very excited to introduce them to you all. I'd like to first tell you about who's here, and then I'll walk through the agenda briefly. But let's start with just letting everyone say hi. So with me today, I have four distinguished women who have done really interesting work throughout their career. Through the Attendify app, you'll be able to look at their CVs and learn a little bit more about them, and you can also connect with them and ask them questions that way. But without further ado, Brigitte Gosling is joining us from google.org. Ana Pinedo is joining us from Amazon, AWS. Mahadia Tunga is calling in from Tanzania, representing the Tanzania Data Lab. And Holly Krambeck is representing the World Bank and their new development data partnership. I will let them all say hi and share their slides in due course. But first, I'd like to just turn to the agenda slide briefly and just let you all know how this session is structured. So next step from where we are, I'll set the stage a little bit, just talk briefly about the topic we're here to discuss and kind of give you a couple of thoughts that we've been sharing around sort of what the value is and how we think partnerships between private sector and technology companies and development sector can be really effective and useful. Then I'd like to hand over the word to my fellow panelists, where Brigitte from google.org and Anna from AWS will talk about how they operate within their companies and how they work around the SDGs. We'll then move on to a discussion where Mahadia and Holly will join us. We have a couple of prepared questions and prompts that we've been thinking through and discussing sort of in our little group here as we've been preparing for this event. And then we'll also open for a general audience Q&A. So I'll encourage you all to submit questions that you have for any of the panelists through the Attendify app, and we will collect them and direct them to the right panelist. So we'll have a couple of questions in the end. A couple of notes, sort of just some housekeeping. First, I want to thank also the government of Switzerland, UNDESA, and the US Statistics Division for inviting us to host this session here. We're really excited about the topic, obviously. The challenge at hand is quite large, so there's a lot of work to do. So we're really excited to talk a little bit about the work we do, learn from a couple of other panelists, but also hear from you in the audience and see what you think about the topic and what we can potentially do together, collaborating and partnering around these issues. We were supposed to have a fifth panelist with us, Andrew from Salesforce. He unfortunately had a family emergency, so he's unable to join us today. But we will bring in some of his thoughts and ideas throughout the conversation as we go through. And the only other thing I will say, keep yourself muted. And unfortunately, there's no kind of we don't have the functionality to kind of intervene in the middle of the conversation, but again, please post your questions to the Attendify app and we will all collect them from there and channel them to the right panelist. I will jump to the slide around setting the stage, and I already introduced the panelists, I guess I'll go right there. I just want to kind of backing up a moment. This quote is this is one of the recommendations from the report of the UN Secretary, the High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation that was released last year. I think the notion and the conviction is quite strong amongst all of us that strong public-private partnerships can be really valuable if structured right, if focused on the right themes, and really kind of done in a mutually respectful way. I think this the call from the high level panel was really around pooling resources, but also kind of pooling R&D efforts and innovation, trying to direct innovation and R&D efforts, I should say, towards some of these global challenges. Obviously, this last couple of months, it feels like a year, even more. This last couple of months, and we've all been in the middle of a global pandemic, has been really difficult for a lot of people. As someone who's, I've worked my whole career around these sort of giant international development challenges, and it's been very humbling and quite sad, actually, to see almost all of the SDG indicators go backwards through this last couple of months. Obviously, with that type of challenge, it calls for more of us to step up and do more. So the objective of this conversation today is certainly to kind of rally around these challenges that we are facing in the world and try to think about creative new ways of engaging and kind of sharing a couple of best practices or lessons learned for how these partnerships are crafted and how they can be effective to really drive change. So I'll stop there. I will, the way this conversation will flow is essentially myself, Brigitte, and Anna will give a high-level overview, just kind of an introduction to what our respective companies do around the SDGs, just so that you are familiar with some of the work that's ongoing. We will then jump into the discussion, as I mentioned, and the last section will have a couple of audience questions, and then we will leave you with a couple of links to different resources that we think could be useful. It could be information around data sets or methodologies or programs or other type of training opportunities and other resources that we think could be useful for the audience to engage with. So I just like to, I'm going to go back, I'm making this really complicated, but I'm going to go back one slide to just pull back the panelist slide again. And I'd like just for all of the panelists to kind of say hi and just engage briefly before we start. So Brigitte, Anna, Mahadia, and Holly, I welcome you all to just unmute yourself and say hi to the audience.
Thanks so much. Hi, Brigitte Gosling. Really glad to be here today, and thanks to the organizers for having us.
Everybody, should I go ahead? I was just going in the order, but Anna Pinheiro-Privet. I am with the sustainability team at Amazon, and equally happy to be here and excited about the opportunity to engage with this panel.
Yeah, Mahadia Tunga from Tanzania Data Lab. I'm excited to be here to share our work and to learn from you.
Hi, Holly Krenbeck from the World Bank. Grateful for all of the other participants. Thanks.
Fantastic. All right, everyone said hi. I will now dive into the first segment, which is a couple of presentations from these respective companies. I'll start off with Facebook. So my name is Anna Lerner. As I mentioned, I lead Facebook's Data for SDGs work. It is a fairly new initiative. And I'll tell you more about it today. The first slide that I like to share focuses on kind of it's a mix of Facebook's core company values, the SDGs, and this little team that I'm working on. So Facebook's overall mission is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. Within that, we have 5 values that we use to guide our day-to-day work. These are pasted plastered all over our hallways and our cafeterias, and it's really something that people take quite seriously and try to align their work very closely to these principles. The last one, circled in yellow, build social value, is obviously the one that my team focuses the most on. And it's something that, our team, but also a lot of colleagues across the company feel really strongly about. Last fall, Facebook announced a commitment to help achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We call this effort Project 17. This is the figure to the right. And we think of it as Facebook's long-term partnership approach to help drive progress on the SDGs. So what does that mean? Well, we think there are a number of areas where Facebook Inc., so all of the different apps and programs and tools that belong to this sort of family of apps. I think there are a lot of areas where we have a unique opportunity to contribute. We've spelled some of them out in this circle. And today we'll talk mostly about data and insights, which is the first one that we kind of decided to work on. So on next slide, you see a couple of quotes. These are sort of these are some of the inspirational quotes that we used when we started thinking about where we could drive outsized impact on the SDGs. As you know, the UN community keeps reminding us all that one of the biggest barriers to achieving the SDGs is a lack of access to real-time and representative data. Given who we are at Facebook and the unique nature of our data, we decided that increasing the availability and the use of data as it relates to the SDGs is a meaningful way for us to contribute. Based on the feedback from partners and experts like many of yourselves listening in, we also decided that our first focus area would be gender data. So moving to next slide, last year at UNGA, Sheryl Sandberg, our COO, hosted a roundtable where she brought together a group of gender experts and really tried to drill down and understand what some of these big questions are that current data isn't able to help the world answer. From that moment, sort of us committing to the gender data theme, from that moment, teams at Facebook have been working to understand better what barriers to gender equality that are brought about by these lack of reliable sex disaggregated gender data. We've released a couple of products and tools throughout this last year to support the gender data space. One of our gender advisors, Ladysmith, released a report together with us called Building Alliances for Gender Equality. That was an assessment of what tech companies and private sector companies could do to strengthen the gender data space. Had a number of specific recommendations for what tech companies, including ourselves, could do. Then we also worked with DevEx, and we convened a community of experts through a webinar series that built and shared knowledge around gender data in the age of COVID. We had almost 9,000 viewers of those webinars, and that told us that there's a really strong and active gender data community out there, and got us really excited about continuing to support this community. We also have something that's called our Insights for Impact program, where our Data for Good team worked with gender rights group Girl Effect to analyze anonymized public Facebook posts to better understand girls' attitudes about their future. This is data that Girl Effect then used to tailor and improve its outreach campaigns. And with Tech Change, we worked on developing a Gender Data 101 course. The course, when we released it earlier this year, was oversubscribed, but the cohort that took the course had some really impressive completion numbers. we were so encouraged by the interest and the commitment by the people who took the course that we're going to run it again in a facilitated way together with our partner Tech Change. But also on this slide, you can see down on the right, you see this a map that's generated around COVID insights that our Data for Good colleagues have been working on, and also a screenshot just from the general Data for Good web page. That's just to say there are a lot of teams across Facebook beyond our Project 17 team that are working to put Facebook data to use for these humanitarian issues, but also other teams working on more sort of tech solutions, AR, VR. We have a lot of product teams that are supporting NGOs and our other social impact partners through fundraising or charitable giving and other things. We have an education team that's working to support this shift from in-person to remote learning. So this is just kind of scratching the surface, but I just wanted to give you a high-level overview of Facebook's commitment to the SDGs and how we're really committed to partnering with organizations that are mission aligned with the SDGs. And are, so far been quite creative around the ways that we can support this community. Now I'd like to hand over to Anna Piviette, who will talk about Amazon's work.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about this program called the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative and give you a little bit of context of what this program is about and why we're focusing on this at Amazon. Next slide, please. Great. Hopefully most of you have heard or are aware in some way that last September, Amazon co-funded the Climate Pledge. And the Climate Pledge is really a commitment, in this case, of all the signatories of this pledge to achieve net zero carbon by 2040. And as you can imagine, this requires a revision and analysis of all our processes and operations across the organization to make sure that we effectively achieve these goals by the time that we determined we were going to achieve them. So there's a lot of innovation required for this process. But there's also an additional role that we feel like Amazon can play in this space, and that's the role of enablement. Some of these challenges, like the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, I'm focusing here on Goal 13 related to climate action. Some of these problems are so big that really require that we bring all the players to the table, and those players bring the best that they can offer to this problem. And so we see an opportunity for Amazon to actually enable others to come to the table and leverage our scale, our technology and infrastructure to achieve some of those goals. Next one, please. So effectively where we focus with the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative is in the effort to reduce the cost and the time, and as well as the technical barriers associated with generating insights for sustainability. And if you think about it, that was mentioning, I'm sure in pretty much all of the sessions that are addressing data, and we've seen it before from the presentation from Anna, there's one of the big challenges in the space of sustainable development is access to meaningful and timely and authoritative data that enables us not only to measure, monitor, and manage the SDGs, but also to provide enough information to ensure that we are on track with those commitments. So what we intend to do with this program and we are doing right now, so this was launched publicly in December 2018, and we've been working with the broader community across all the sectors to basically support this goal. Next one, please. Okay, this is a little bit busy, so don't focus too much on the bottom part. I just put the links there for your awareness if you want to follow up, but I just wanted to give you a very high level overview of what this program offers. So we're very focused in three core pillar areas. The first one being the democratization of data, and what that means is that we engage, as I mentioned, with different partners and users around the world, the scientific community, as well as the private sector and NGOs and and so forth. And we try to identify what are those key data sets that are critical for this conversation, for sustainability and sustainable development in general. And once we identify those data sets, we then host them on the AWS cloud and make them publicly available to anybody free of cost. And there's a link there if you want to visit the catalog that we currently have, which covers anything from weather and climate data to socioeconomic indicators and population and remote sensing and very diverse set of data. And then the second component is recognizing that the data made available is very valuable, but we need to enable people to actually have the tools and the analytics. So we have different mechanisms to do that. One of
get data much more available. Produce these labeled data sets that'll be open. They'll be mostly run by and supported by universities and out there in the world. And there are open calls now, quick plug, for both agriculture and language on the platform.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you. That was really fascinating. We started a couple of months back, no, actually last year, to kind of connect a couple of the tech companies. We sometimes meet in San Francisco, or we just have a call and we kind of share experiences. And I just want to say I've been so inspired by work that's been going on at Google.org, AWS, also at Salesforce. Andrew, who couldn't be here with us today, he's doing some really amazing work around this space. We've also been joined by Lyft, Uber, Airbnb, and others. And yeah, so from someone coming from the development sector, I spent, my first 5 years in Southern Africa in Mozambique, and then another many years, 7 maybe, at the World Bank. I really feel like I'm among friends in this working group here, kind of sitting inside a tech company, but surrounded by fellow colleagues who are so passionate and really dedicated to solving some of these really big, complex challenges. So again, thank you for being here. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation coming up. So discussion, you know who's online. I think we'll dive straight into the discussion. The first theme that we wanted to talk about was making the case for SDGs. So we've been thinking a little bit internally at Facebook about, how do we make more teams aware of the SDGs? How do we kind of expand the group of people who are working dedicatedly on these global challenges? So my first question, I'll ask Anna, I think, but then I'll give a brief answer myself as well, how we do it inside Facebook. But my first question is around how do you build appetite and interest internally inside your company to prioritize or align with these with the global goals? Anna, do you have some thoughts to share?
Sure. And maybe just to stay on the theme that I had in my presentation related to climate action, which is something that we are, Amazon has demonstrated or shown externally a lot of commitment to. I think it really came from an overall commitment of the organization to the climate pledge, and that draws the need across the entire organization. So it's, there was a lot of work already being done in the different groups and teams, but setting this goal at the top level really forces that we reevaluate everything we do and make an alignment. So I would think that was an effective way to push for climate action in this case.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you, Anna. The one tactic I wanted to share kind of from our work at Facebook is obviously it depends a little bit on the company, right? It depends on how the company communicates, how the company is structured. In the case of Facebook, Facebook is very focused on building community globally, right? But that also goes for inside the company. So we use something that's called Workplace, which is kind of an internal communication tool. to make sure that everyone's up to date. We have sort of our knowledge management channels. Everything is done there. When we launched Project 17, we essentially created, it sounds ridiculous, but we created a workplace group around these SDGs and our work. When we announced this to the wider company, kind of describing what the SDGs are and the type of organizations that care about these goals, the type of partners we would work with, and kind of described a little bit our thinking and techniques for how to achieve these goals. Overnight, we had about 1,000 people from all across the company joining this group and kind of flagging that they're really interested in these issues and they would like to stay involved or updated about on the work going forward. It has grown a lot since then, but I feel like that kind of initial bump for the first day was a strong signal that a lot of colleagues independently care a lot about these issues and have kind of been looking for a way to sort of channel that interest or that sort of passion. So we started a workplace group, and then in that group, we invite colleagues to post things that are relevant. So Facebook recently had a kind of a sustainability, a carbon announcement, and that team posted that announcement and tagged it to the climate change SDG and wrote a little bit about it in the context of the SDGs. The same we have, back in the days when we were all in the office, we have commuter support. We have a team that's supporting colleagues to bike to work and find safe bike routes and tune up their bikes and make sure that people can use sort of carbon neutral transportation. In the same way, that team, the team always posts their monthly updates in our group, tags it to the right SDG, and kind of encourage people to get involved that way. Obviously, during COVID, we've had a massive investment in health tools and health data, misinformation around COVID, all of that. So that's also been posted in the same place and tagged to the right SDGs. So that's the way we've been working to try to kind of rally interest and appetite across the company. The other thing I will say also, we've benefited from two really big internal champions. So Ime Archibald used to be our VP for partnerships. He was the one who initiated Project 17. So the fact that such a kind of prominent person inside the company took a stance and said, this is really important, we're going to align to these goals, and then having Cheryl every year who goes to New York during the General Assembly and talk about women's rights and the importance of gender data, that's been really helpful for us when we try to align more work and drive more work towards the SDGs. But again,
Anna, if I could add, I think it would be relevant to mention also, because based on what you're saying, it reminded me that we actually have a very strong grassroots interest in sustainability across Amazon, and that's mostly reflected through this sustainability ambassador program, where we have basically an organization of Amazonians working to expand the different efforts globally. And that's been a very interesting way to see like the interest and the commitment to sustainability come from the bottom up. I was telling you initially the top down, but there's really, and that's one of the things that has been excited to run the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative, is that although we're trying to focus externally, I constantly get different employees across the organization. They say, hey, how can I be part of that? And people really get committed behind these ideas. So just to speak to that, it's great to find those people that are like-minded and focus on the solution space. So anyway, just would like to share that.
Thank you, Anna. I remember Andrew also talking a lot about at Salesforce, they have a certain percentage of their time where they're allowed to volunteer. And I think he talked about that one being a strong kind of connector also to create that sort of internal community of people who really are passionate about these topics. The second one I just wanted to kind of, and now I'll call out Bridget here. I'm curious if you have any experience or thoughts around how do you navigate trade-offs or competing priorities, or even like how do you align goals across internal teams? We obviously we approach a lot of teams that have a different roadmap, maybe different goals, and then we say, oh, and in addition, we want you to kind of look at this from from a social impact perspective or something like that. Do you have any thoughts around how to do that effectively if we have someone in the audience maybe that's trying to do this internally in their organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just you hit on one piece that has certainly been effective for us, which is just continuing to find alignment. And I think that really just requires, a deep understanding of what other aspects of our company are doing, what is on their roadmap, looking for those touch points, and using the fact that we have maybe more external relationships, understanding of maybe where partners are coming from, getting feedback that we might be getting from our grantee organizations, to say, hey, if you were to maybe consider this down the line. And I think also just having patience, knowing that that might take time, right? That we might be talking about something that seems quite promising, but might not get prioritized or necessarily come to fruition. And it could take a couple of years in some cases, but the scale that we might be operating at, or the potential reach that those efforts could be worth it. One example is we just recently, our research team, and we had, as with many things at Google, right, things are happening that we may or may not have something to do with, but we've been talking to them for a while about a desire to open up some of the search trends around health factors. And this is the other thing that is definitely true for our company, and I'm guessing for many more based on what we've seen this year, but opportunistic moments also create opportunities for kind of reprioritization. So for COVID and also, sort of other infectious diseases, they've now released, over the past couple of months, have released a search symptoms data set that epidemiologists and other researchers can use in their work. It's something that had been talked about for a while, but just hadn't necessarily gotten to the point that's enabled with differential privacy. Everything's anonymized, but these are now trends so that researchers who are wondering, if people are searching for fever or other aspects of their symptoms can now see how that might be materializing and put that data along other data that they're using for COVID modeling, or as we get into flu season, flu modeling. So again, just an opportunistic, I think, push to say, hey, we really need this right now as a globe. What might we do? How might we, see additional effort flow in that direction? And so I always tell external groups and internal, to think that like those opportunities are not seen at large companies is not the case, right? Those types of moments are quite motivating, and I think we've seen that across the board with organizations this year stepping up in the face of the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think that kind of the racial justice aspect that the events of the fall of this summer has really been a driver also inside Facebook, where people have just been like, hold up, we need to rethink, reprioritize. And yeah, it's been quite inspiring. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to move to the next set of questions. And this was focusing a little more about kind of fostering uptake and use. So just sharing data, obviously, or sharing tools, or launching a training isn't enough. If this isn't the right tool, if it's not useful data, and if our partners are not aware of it, it won't have the intended impact, right? So we've been thinking a lot about how we at Facebook ensure that our data are meaningfully used. And I know that on the line, we actually have both Holly and Mahadia, who represent organizations that are really critical pieces to this ecosystem to make sure that data that is shared is actually being used and is useful to partners and on the ground organizations. So maybe I'll turn to Holly first. Holly, would you like to talk a little bit about the Development Data Partnership, obviously, but also tell us a little bit about your tactics and thoughts around how you make sure that data is used and can be useful for partners?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. So hello, everybody. I manage the Development Data Partnership. This is a partnership between international organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, and companies, expanding the use of company data in international development projects. So very relevant to our discussion. To match company data to the SDG use cases, we use a kind of market accessible to our data partners and staff. Through our portal, staff can find data and submit proposals for their use in projects. And to ensure the intended use cases are reasonable, only proposals that are approved by the staff's international organization and the data partner are granted permission to move forward. Also, after a team submits a proposal, it's posted on our portal for every staff of every international development organization to see. So there's a lot of transparency, a lot of eyes on each use case. So to ensure meaningful use, we leverage a market to link data to use cases. We have a dual approval system and yeah, a lot of transparency. Thanks.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Holly. We'll be hearing more from you and for the partnership shortly, but I just wanted to turn to Mahadia as well. I would love for you to first just kind of tell us a little bit about the Tanzania Data Lab, but then also think about, share a couple of thoughts around how you work on the D Lab to make sure that some of these resources that are published by, you know, governments or UN or private sector, how they're being actually used practically by people every day.
Okay, thank you. So Tanzania Data Lab is a non-governmental organization which focuses on ensuring that data is effectively and frequently used at different levels. That means from community to the national government level. So going back to your question, so we work into a different broad spectrum in a sense that the first thing that we normally do is community engagement, like engaging the community, understand what are the core challenges in the community, so that because we believe that whatever solution you want to produce or data that you have to share, if it's not solving a particular pain point in the community, that data might not be used. So that's the first thing we do: engage the community. We conduct listening campaign, understand what are the pertinent challenges, and then from that then we engage a relevant stakeholder to share data. So when we engage with the community, we normally create some use cases, and then we conduct like roundtables to ensure that these communities, these use cases are actually being taken up. But the private sector or the national government is producing data that can fit in. But also at D-Lab, from the community challenges as well, we actually launch innovation windows. So for instance, we had an innovation window on early pregnancy. So we found that in the community, that was the challenge. And then we designed innovation window on early pregnancy. So that means calling in innovators to tackle the challenge. So in that case, you are driving the use of data to solve a pertinent challenge in the community. So our way is really on ensuring that we are solving the pertinent challenge. And the other thing that I want to share is also our curriculum also. Our curriculum, because also one of the challenges that hinder or the data use is also skill gaps. So so we also try to engage with different partners, ensuring that we are actually working together to solve that problem. For instance, we worked with IREX at some point to develop subnational data curriculum. We work with CRDB Bank, one of the banks here in Tanzania, to train young entrepreneurs on how they can use data to inform their business, because that is the win-win scenario. They become bankable, but at the same time, they use data to inform their business. So the whole point that I want to emphasize is actually to understand what are the pertinent challenge and then link them to the data or solution that you're producing. Thank you.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Mahadia. That's really great. Lots of good examples of practical projects that you guys are working on. It actually took us very nicely to the second prompt for this theme, which was what capacity and skills are necessary within partner organizations and the broader community to enable that use. I'll come back to you, Mahadia, but I wanted to ask Holly first. For your development data partnership, you talk about it as kind of a market mechanism. mechanism. So you bring in private sector data, you display it, and then you invite project team leaders and experts across the bank to kind of well, not just the bank, the IMF, et cetera, other organizations, to come and make use of those data sets and kind of pull them. Do you also offer some type of training, or are you building their skills and kind of doing quick, rapid assessments of these, or is that provided by like support staff, or how do you make sure that these data is actually used?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess there's a few pieces there. One, I do want to clarify that through our partnerships, when we do receive data from partners, the data themselves are not visible to everyone. just descriptions of the data that our staff can apply for. It's of course, one challenge is providing our domain experts with the data science expertise they need to make meaningful use of these data. But actually, there are a lot more pieces. To make these work, I would say the first capacity necessary is the ability and freedom to coordinate across teams in an international organization. And I say freedom because when our program first started, we definitely didn't have the authority, but we were building something that was needed. And because of that, we could get volunteer support. And that support came from all over the place to help us answer some fundamental challenges, like what problem are we solving? And that comes from our domain experts, our transport, water, health, energy specialists. And then how do we establish trust with the data partners? And that comes from our legal teams who built our foundation with our data license agreements and data privacy policies. And then the big one is how do we securely and responsibly manage the data? And that comes mostly from our information technology services colleagues who support us on information security, the data engineering process for how do we ingest data, how do we store the data, how do we facilitate access to the data, how do we monitor how data are being used, as well as support for our market portal and code collaboration tools. It's just a lot of different types of expertise that needs to come together. And then the last piece that we alluded to in the beginning is how do we actually create insights to the data? And that comes from our data scientists. I think one of the reasons why we don't see more of these amazing collaborations is because of this. There's so many different types of capacities and skills needed to really pull them together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I know Anna raised her hand and wanted to add to this. So I'll invite Anna here.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to add to what was said about the need to build this trust and transparency in this process, and just speak a little bit to the way that we've been trying to manage that with the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative and the catalog that we're building. And the attempt we have there is to retain the control and ownership of the data as much with the data providers and the data owners versus we going and getting the data and bringing it to the cloud. So in practice, how it works is that when we identify a data set that is of value to the community, we invite that data provider, data owner to distribute the data through the cloud. We cover all the costs, but they retain all the ownership and control over the data. And in one way that helps us in terms of like scaling, but on the other side, we hear from the community in general that the trust and integrity of the data is really important. So I just wanted to share that model. That is something that we could put at the table as well. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes, I think actually I'll loop in Brigitte here as well, because we've been at Facebook. We've been building out an ecosystem support program, particularly to support skills building, adequate training, and kind of tailored building up some of these, taking down some of these barriers. And I just wanted to say we've been very inspired by Bridget's work at Google. So I just wanted to invite her here also, because I know you guys do a lot of work on training and kind of using different techniques, challenges, etc., to try to upskill the overall community.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So one of the things, the program that I mentioned that funded Macro Area University's project that I spoke about was actually a challenge that we ran in 2018, an open call for organizations to submit their ideas for how they would use AI and machine learning, with their own data or data that they plan to collect to actually, further achieve their missions. We received 2,600 submissions to that challenge, which I always just mention because I think it's a good reminder of how much opportunity is still out there. Of those, we funded only 20 with $25 million total. And I do want to say, I think it's, it is critical that we think about what funding is available for these types of applications and use cases, not just for our organizations to be providing that funding, but for any funders out there, private foundations, doing work with data, doing data science still costs money, and it often requires support. It's not the type of thing that organizations can just do magically out of the work that they already have going. So always a push to really make sure that we're investing in that. The organizations that we worked with in that challenge participated in an accelerator that we ran over 9 months, where they were each paired with an AI coach from Google and really supported in the way that they were thinking about collecting their data, storing it, and using it in their models, and then productizing those models to actually be useful in the decisions that they wanted to try to shift, or the applications they wanted to build. Unfortunately, 20 organizations is a very small number. And so we do think a lot about how we might continue to scale some of that. And you saw some of that in the work that we're doing around reducing barriers with projects like Lacuna Fund. But we also draw on a lot of resources that the company, that Google has put out across the board. One that I'll just flag that I think is tremendously valuable is the People in AI guidebook. It's called PAIR guidebook if you are Googling it at home. Just a really good sense of how machine learning and human-centered design intersect. So how we should think about implementing these types of models, what questions should be asked at each stage of the process. And it's been, I think, a very helpful tool for even organizations who are asking themselves, how can data and machine learning actually be useful and analytics be useful in my work? And is this something I even want to pursue going forward? So I just wanted to shout out that particular resource and many others that we, and I know other companies have made available to try to even just lower the barrier to thinking about what types of processes and projects might be possible and worth the investment, because it is always, this isn't, there's always trade-offs to the things that we ask our organizations and our especially social sector organizations to take on. And so I want to always be conscious of this work not becoming a distraction from the core work that organizations are achieving.
That's great. Thank you so much, Bridget. We're going to move to the third discussion theme, which is around measuring impact. And here I wanted to invite Mahadia, because I know you guys have been thinking a lot about this. So I'm curious to know what your experience is in terms of measuring the impact of the work you're doing, and if you have some specific tactics you use to define, measure, or communicate some of this SDG impact. I'm kind of clustering these two questions in the interest of time here. Mahadia, do you have some thoughts here?
Thank you. So in terms of measuring impacts, from our case, we have like 3 ways. One, as I said, DLab has an innovation innovation pillar. So when we see that, as I mentioned in my previous example, like the innovation that are coming up are driven by the data that have been shared, so that we know that, okay, we are doing well. On the other thing, also, for instance, the tools that we are building. For instance, we developed a data visualization dashboard using data from one of the organization here called SISEMA. So the data was a CDR, children from hard condition were calling in to report their cases. So when we published that data visualization dashboard, actually it forced SISEMA to change their target areas. So they wanted to focus northern part, and then they realized actually the problem is on the southern part. So that you can tell that the tool that you're developing is actually being impactful in the sense that it's being used. But also understand the dialogue. If the data that you have shared creates a dialogue, and then you know that that data is actually being impactful. For instance, recently we just ended a campaign called Say Money Data, like talk with data, which we were sharing data on male and HIV testing. So with that campaign, then we found that over like 5,000 target group are actually engaging on the conversation. And then we see that, okay, so that data is actually impactful because for me, the most important aspect to measure is use. And as the previous speakers mentioned, just sharing the data will not drive the use, but you need to trigger the discussion. And there are different ways that can be used to trigger the discussion, but one or some few being building skills of people, because sometimes you might be sharing data, but people don't have skills. Your target group, because I'm talking the target group, does not have the necessary skills, because that will limit the use of that data. So yeah, so measuring impact is one aspect, and then the other aspect is discussing on how can you actually trigger the demand for that data that you are actually sharing. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. That's really helpful. Thank you, Mahadia. I think this is an interesting topic. I think we had some questions that already come in kind of around how some of these private sector companies are measuring their contribution to the SDGs. And I think this is certainly something we haven't quite figured out at Facebook. But I was inspired by some of your ideas here, Mahadia, on how you guys work on tracking and measuring impacts. I think there are massive challenges even on measuring and tracking the SDGs with the indicators that were specified as they were. I can't remember now off the top of my head. It's like 68% or something like that of all the indicators don't have, of all the goals don't have useful indicators to measure and track progress. At the same time, we don't want to kind of reinvent the wheel and create some new type of measurement structure. So we don't, at Facebook at least, we don't have a good answer exactly how to do this yet. This is something we're going to spend the coming months thinking about. We're part of a technology partnership called Vision 2030 Vision. It's co-hosted by ARM and UNDP and World Economic Forum. And one of the work streams that we're supporting in there is trying to think about how can we better measure and track attribution and contribution to the SDGs from some of these efforts. But obviously, as anyone who's worked on open data or this type of data tooling knows, it's very difficult to track these things. You kind of end up in measuring things that are not quite as useful as what you'd really like to get down to. I will encourage you all to take a look at Salesforce. They have some really interesting work where they support impact management. They support the impact management maturity of a lot of their partners. They also have a couple of reports and frameworks for how to track, if you're, for example, a non-governmental organization, for how you can better track your contributions to the SDGs. So it's a bummer that Andrew isn't here with us today, but I just wanted to flag that and point you into that direction. I'm sure we can dig out the links and share them later on as well. Moving forward, we have a last theme for discussion before we open up for additional questions. This theme is around partnerships. So there's a lot of massive opportunities. Obviously, we talked about some of them for how to partner around data and technology to drive progress on the SDGs. But partnerships need to be structured well, and they need to be based on mutual trust and respect, and obviously a lot of transparency. So I'm curious. Actually, I'll invite all of you actually to give your best tips and tricks for how to create these strong, positive, and impactful partnerships. Maybe we'll start with the reverse order. So if Mahadia, you start, then I'll invite Holly, Anna, and then Bridget.
Okay. So thank you once again. So in driving the meaningful partnership, especially the public-private partnership, I'll maybe share our work with Tanzania Data Lab. So for us, as I always mention, we normally start with the challenge. We worked with the Paris 21 and National Bureau of Statistics on mapping SDG indicators using ADAPT tool. And what we found that only 39% of the data that National Bureau of Statistics is producing can respond to SDG indicators. And then that drove us to think of how can we bring in non-state actors to complement on that. And then we formulated a partnership between the National Bureau of Statistics, DLab, UN Statistical Division, DFID, and other organizations to support the non-traditional data into official statistics. Based on the gaps that we have established. And then at the end of the day, we were able to lead the national data roadmap and the national data roadmap. And last 2 weeks, actually, the implementation has started where the National Bureau of Statistics, which we actually hosted the workshop on big data analytics. We involved mobile network operators in identifying on how can we use mobile data to respond to some of the SDG indicators. So for us, the lesson that I'm trying to bring in is also starting with the challenge and then understanding who will be able to support in that particular challenge, but obviously being honest from the beginning so that everybody understands who does what and what's the implication of the partnership and what the important thing is to build the trust and complement on each other's effort. I mean, each other's strength. Yeah, thank you.
Holly, do you have some thoughts?
I fully agree with Madia and support her 100%. And then I guess just to add, through our work, we're filling a gap, helping our government partners leverage more granular and timely data generated by private firms to help them make better decisions. But all of these projects, in essence, are experiments, right? There isn't a very lengthy playbook we can follow on, which data sets combined which ways will generate the most meaningful insights sustainably for our partners. And so I think one of the prominent unique characteristics of these partnerships is that the risk is pretty big. These things may work or they may not, but we'll never know until we try. And if they work, the reward is so great. I think we have to make them work. In addition to the trust and transparency that Madia just talked about, we found that when bringing together the public and nonprofit sector, there are some unique characteristics of the partnership that need to be met. And some firms that are very large, like Facebook and Google, have many resources and wonderful programs to make these things work, and AWS sustainability. But smaller firms may not. And so for those, we need to support them on ensuring privacy is protected, on ensuring that there are tangible benefits on both sides, and that there is very little work required on the part of the data partner. And so the onus is to build a system around that, which we normally wouldn't do for a typical partnership. I should say that moving forward, we would love to work with colleagues, say at AWS. I loved Anna's comments on how their initiative reduces cost, time, and technical barriers associated with data analytics, leverage the comparative advantage of cloud companies to handle this part. I think is brilliant and a good idea. And then I guess there was a question about examples of partnerships. I think our program fills its little niche, but I would love to see more of these partnerships at scale, especially something that empowers national governments to do something similar. We're acting as a go-between, but eventually building that capacity for governments, I think, is really important too. So that's it. Thank you.
Is it my turn? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that was said before me. I would add a couple of things, at least from our experience and other roles that I played in partnerships before even joining Amazon. I feel like it's really important that the goals of the partnership really closely align with the mission of the organizations that are involved in the project. I find that there's always more commitment and people tend to stay at the table longer if they are getting something out of it individually, because it's just the nature of this project. And then the other thing is that I feel like partnerships should be seen as a dynamic process, and you have to constantly be reevaluating the effectiveness of the collaboration and the contributions and the deliverables in response to the impact that you're creating. So that's something that we try to keep in mind, and not just set a plan at the beginning and run it through, but you have to constantly reevaluate what's working or not and bring to the surface the lessons learned as much as possible. So, yeah.
I'll just underscore one theme that I think was clear through all of those remarks, which is that the more action-oriented and specific a partnership is, also the more successful in our experience. So rather than thinking about the big, grand, hypothetical ways that we might, quote, partner with organizations, really thinking about how can we identify that problem, identify those unique roles, and figure out where we can plug in to support. Usually in the case of these types of issues, organizations who have been working on them for much longer than we have, and will continue to work on them for much longer than we will, and looking for those specific, time-bound, meaningful contributions that we can make, and that others can, of course, bring to the table as well, rather than trying to create something that is way too large to actually act on.
That's great. No, these are all extremely helpful pointers, and I think we even had new connections for future partnerships, even just among us here on the panel. So that's great. We're getting a lot of questions in through the Q&A. I'm going to do my best to channel some of them. We don't have tons of time left, so I'll jump on a couple of them, and then my colleague Samir and I will do our best to, through the Attendify platform, go in and offer answers to as many of the others that we can, or seek clarifications from the other panelists for the ones that we don't have time to answer. We'll do our best. I can't promise we answer all of them because there are lots of them, but we will do our best. The first one I wanted to answer, and I'll start here because I think it's kind of a little bit of a tricky question, so I want to give I don't know if maybe Bridget would have an answer as well, but no problem if you don't. I'll take this one. But one of the first questions we got was from Jusmizan, I believe, from the Malaysian Department of Statistics. The question is the following: how is data that can be considered sensitive, how can that be shared transparently with government parties or agencies? This is a complicated question that probably merits a long conversation, but to try to be specific about it, first of all, at least from Facebook's side, we don't share data with governments. We have a program called Data for Good, where we share aggregated insights with social impact partners and researchers. We have other programs around data and insights that are also where we partner with researchers. For example, we partner with Social Science One through sort of curated access for some of those data sets. So I just want to be clear on that. And then how does this go about? What type of data sets would that pertain? Well, some of these data sets are public. So when we deem that the data sets are not sensitive, then we're able to share them publicly. And then we either share them through our Data for Good webpage or on UN OCHA's Humanitarian Data Exchange. So the best place to go for these non-sensitive open data sets that Facebook have shared and a lot of other organizations also would be to go to the Humanitarian Data Exchange. And then for insights that are a little more sensitive, we use 3 tactics to ensure and improve the privacy preservation of data that or data or aggregated insights that we share. One is controlled or managed access. So it's very specific. We're very specific about who can access them and how and for what purposes. Even if we work with a humanitarian organization, let's say UN OCHA or Red Cross, it's not kind of an all full access to these insights for everyone in that organization. It would be one individual person, and they would have very specific and controlled access to make sure that they're following all the rules and policies around accessing these insights. Then we also use aggregated results, and we aggregate it up until a point where we feel like it's safe and privacy preserving enough. And in the same bucket, I would put consent. So, for example, the location data that Facebook shares through some of these heat maps is always from people who've opted in to be part of this. The same goes for surveys. Tomorrow, actually, we're very excited about this. Tomorrow, we're about to launch several surveys that are focusing on gender equality and that are giving really interesting snapshots around how small business owners and women have fared during COVID. We were asking questions like, have your domestic care responsibilities increased during COVID? Are you able to put food on the table for everyone in your household, etc.? And it's a global survey, so stay tuned for that tomorrow. But it's just to say people who are answering these surveys are asked ahead of time, and they are voluntarily contributing to asking these surveys. The last area that the last kind of tactic that we're using is using very advanced privacy preserving methodologies to protect these data and insights that are in them. That's kind of a very shortened answer to a very complicated question. Bridget, do you want to add, or should we jump to the next question?
Yeah, I think we can jump just to our answers to be very similar. We actually do very, very, very little of this, of sharing our own information. Some of the COVID examples I gave are one of the first times in the recent years where we've done that.
I can give a response if you're helpful. It's up to you.
No, go ahead. That's perfect. Sorry, I thought I was on mute.
Yeah, sure. Because in some ways, we're not unlike a government agency where we do have the challenge where we do work with very sensitive data, and we have staff across different departments, which could be likened to different government agencies. And how do we do that? In our experience through the partnership, it's a 3-pronged approach. First, it starts with policy for secure data handling. The data has to be classified, and each classification then would, in a standard way, describe how the data are secured. So, is it 2-factor authentication? Is it single factor? And how do we monitor, et cetera? So data security policy, and then data privacy policy, and then responsible data use policy. And we find often our clients don't necessarily have all 3. And it's a starting point because with those policies, that informs how you design your IT architecture and your institutions to effectively implement and enforce those policies. But that is not enough. The third part we found is socialization. because what we find is our staff, they understand that it is wrong to say, steal money or steal a laptop. But when it comes to sharing data, it's not so intuitive that just, if the data is sensitive or proprietary, that giving that data to someone else is just as bad as if it were a physical good or money. And so a lot of socialization is necessary and training among staff to understand these three critical policies, why they're important, and the end game. So that's what I was thinking of when you asked the question.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Holly. I think those are really important perspectives. And I think as the overall sector is becoming more, exploring more of these type of partnerships, is there are more data sets out there, there are more open source tools that people who might not be super specialized statisticians or data scientists can still start accessing more and more data. I think as that is growing, people will become more comfortable and just kind of operate it in a more responsible way. I would also say there's a lot of methodologies out there. I mean, at Facebook, we publish all the methodologies around all the data sets we release, what data goes in and what methodologies we use to privacy preserve them. So all of that is in either on the Facebook research web page or the Data for Good web page. So I encourage everyone that's curious to look at that. There were a couple of questions around the same theme. So I feel like we pulled those together around sort of transparency around the data. I have another question. I think this might be specifically for Bridget or Anna. Roberto from Northwestern Biological Center for Research is asking, are there support programs from companies to obtain AI cloud infrastructure time for data science students that are oriented towards the SDGs? I don't know if one of you would like to come in there.
I'm happy to provide some input. As I mentioned, as part of the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative, we provide access to cloud credits, and that means use of the services on AWS, including AI. We do have programs on AWS that work directly with universities to provide those kind of resources. So I'm happy to follow up and put that person in contact with the right resources if that's helpful.
Yes, and we have Google Cloud Research credits available, and I'll put the link to that page in the Attendify platform so you can check that out.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. We're out of time. Not surprised. This is a really interesting topic, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we're going to wrap up here. We'll do our best to try to answer the outstanding questions on the Attendify platform or connect you to people who we think could answer those questions. Here in the last slide, you have a couple of links to resources that were mentioned during the conversation. And we'll make sure that if there are other questions, please keep asking your questions on the Attendify platform, and we will make sure that we'll connect you with resources or the right person. From my own personal perspective, I'm very thankful for this conversation. I think it's really interesting. As I mentioned before, I was always on the international development side and tried to kind of figure out how to engage private sector partners. We had early partnerships with Microsoft and others at the World Bank at the time. And I'm so encouraged by all the work that's happening around the world, both kind of everyone stepping up as part of the COVID pandemic, and now the massive economic recovery work that we're all going to have to get into. But also just kind of coming together and being really transparent about resources, but also limitations. What are the challenges that we're dealing with? Certainly from Facebook's perspective, but I'm sure everyone would agree to this, we haven't figured it all out. We're still learning tons all the time. There are real trade-offs in terms of some of the insights that our partners are asking for and some of the privacy preserving aspects that we need to consider. So sometimes we're not able to provide what people would really like to see. And I think that's part of this partnership, kind of noodling on these, how to create these effective partnerships. we're very committed to our gender data focus, but at Facebook, we'll keep expanding and start looking at additional areas where we can support the SDGs. Obviously, Google.org and AWS have very broad programs as well across their companies of teams and resources that are accessible. So hoping for a potential in-person World Data Forum next year, if things align, the world calms down a little bit, that would be really great. I would love to continue the conversation at that point. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much to my fellow panelists. I'm so inspired by all of you and the work that you do, and very grateful that you all chose to spend all of this time with us today. Thank you also to all of you who tuned in. We had a lot of people listening in. We've been hearing stats updates throughout the conversation, so super excited about that. Very thankful for all of you, and hope to continue this conversation. Before I close this, any final thoughts, anything you want to share, a parting message from my fellow panelists? Maybe Bridget, you want to go first?
Yeah, just thank you again to everyone, and also want to just emphasize that the more conversations and collaboration we're having around these topics, appreciate Anna and team's work to bring more of us together, the more progress we're going to make. So look forward to continuing this conversation as well as many others as we try to use the limited resources we all have available to try to reach these goals in record time.
Yeah, same here. Just thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. And I agree. I believe these problems are too big for any of us to solve alone. So we need to all bring the best we have to the table together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I also second my fellow panelists. We need to find ways to strengthening these private-public partnership, but just one thing that I want to leave up to you is on how we build data use culture, especially in this African context where we have limited infrastructure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you from me as well, especially to Facebook for organizing the session and also being one of our first data partners and went through the learning curve with us. We're so grateful. And AWS, who gave us a bunch of credits to help us through all of the COVID-19 data processing. So very grateful. And also all of the government agencies who have joined this session. I hope that you found this really interesting and it sparks a lot of ideas on how you could use these data in your work. So thanks to all, and yeah, happy to collaborate more.
Thank you so much, Holly. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.